They were the heroes from the future. Teenagers protecting the universe from those that would sow the seeds of chaos. Each had unique powers and abilities. And though they often had their differences, they came together to save the day as the Legion of Superheroes. Now, you can be a part of their adventures and learn the history of the future in the Legion Clubhouse.
This week on the Legion Clubhouse, well, we really don't have any. Sorry, everybody. I am out this week to watch my son, who is a senior in high school, play soccer, and I don't get to go to very many of his games, and so I want to make it to all of the home games. So that's why we do not have a Legion Clubhouse this week as far as continuing on from where we've been. But I do have an encore presentation of an interview that I did with Bill Schelly, who wrote the book Otto Binder, The Life and Work of a Comic Book and Science Fiction Visionary. This goes all the way back to our very first episode of the Legion Clubhouse. Check it out if you haven't before. And we will be back next time. Otto Binder's name was dropped several times in the first issue discussion, and many of you may not know who Otto Binder is. Fortunately, Bill Schelly is an author who's been immersed in the world of science fiction and comics since the mid-1960s. He made his first contributions to pop culture through his comics fanzine Sense of Wonder, and since then, he has been chronicling the history of comics fandom and some of the greatest comic book creators in books and novels and articles that are out there for everyone. One of his most recent works is Otto Binder, The Life and Work of a Comic Book and Science Fiction Visionary. I had a chance to sit down with Schelly to talk about Binder's life. How did you discover Otto Binder?
I discovered Otto Binder when I picked up a comic book on a newsstand as an 8-year-old. And it was the first Superman Annual #1, which was published in 1960. And it turns out he wrote 6 of the 9 stories in that annual, which is the comic book that made me into a comic book fan. So it started me on my lifelong habit of reading and loving comics.
Binder, though, didn't start in comic books, though. That's the thing that I think is most amazing, is that he really got to start in the pulps with his brother.
Yeah, Otto Binder started in the pulps with his brother Earl as a writing team, E&O Binder. And they started in 1932 and gradually became more popular, made more sales, but finally, when Otto moved to New York in the late 30s, they really couldn't keep up the partnership the same way, and his brother didn't really want to either. So Otto took it over, and so most of these E&O Binder stories that are seen in science fiction pulps and Adam Link and so on are really just written by Otto.
Well, I find that really interesting because even after they had formally dissolved their writing partnership, Otto was still a pretty cool guy to say, hey, as long as I'm writing as E&O Binder, I'm going to send you some money each time that that something is published.
Otto tried to take care of his brother Earl by sending him money even after the partnership was broken up, yes, and also by helping him find markets when his brother later decided to try writing solo.
Interesting. I'm curious, why did Binder travel to New York? Was he in Ohio?
No, he was in Chicago.
Oh, Chicago, okay.
Otto Binder was a key player in Chicago science fiction fandom in the 30s. It was a hotbed of science fiction fans, probably the most impressive group of such fans in the country at the time. But he was working with a man named Otis Albert Klein. And Klein, K-L-I-N-E, was a literary agent who was a writer but was also a literary agent, and he needed a representative in New York. And Klein didn't want to move to New York, so he asked Otto, would you go there and be my representative? And, of course, this was a golden opportunity for Otto because as Klein's representative, he could also sell his own stories and learn all the ins and outs and make all the contacts, so it helped him tremendously as a writer to do that.
I think that's really fascinating because and I was reading the biography that you wrote of him. It's so fascinating because by taking this leap and saying, yes, I will be your representative in New York, he was able to not only learn the business to better his own career, but he had the ability to connect with what today we consider some of the biggest names in comic books and pulp novels of the time.
Well, yes. When Otto went to New York, he did make a lot of connections, and when comic books came around in the early '40s, his friends became leaders and editors at DC Comics. One of his closest friends was Mort Weisinger, who came to Otto one time and said, "Hey, Otto, I have this opportunity to work at DC. How do you write for comic books?" And so Otto, who had been in comics for a couple of years, sort of told Mort how to approach it, and that essentially helped Mort get his job as a DC editor. And at the same time, Julius Schwartz also needed work, and eventually, I think in 1944, became an editor at DC as well. So these were two of Otto's best friends.
And they had gone on like road trips together, right?
Right. They drove across the country at least twice together, the three of them in the car, to visit Ray Bradbury in California and to meet Fourier Ackerman in California, who was also a prominent science fiction fan. And so they used to play bridge, have all-night bridge games together. So they were very close.
Mort Weisinger, Julius Schwartz, Ray Bradbury, H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, it's just like a who's who of everyone that's writing back in the 1930s and 40s. To me, it boggles my mind. But can you clarify or maybe tell us what is this story that I hear that he may have had some influence in the creation of Superman?
Well, supposedly, Otto talked about to Richard Lupoff and others that he had met Jerry Siegel, a very young Jerry Siegel, at a meeting in Chicago of science fiction fans. Siegel had been publishing a fanzine, a science fiction fanzine, and they were talking, and Otto later said he came up with an idea of an alien from another planet coming to Earth and having powers as a result and becoming a hero on Earth due to the things that he could do based on his birth on another planet. So if this were true, it became a pretty central part of the Superman mythos, but Otto never really talked about it later and talked about it in public. So, it's hard to know for sure if that element did come, but it's an intriguing story, isn't it?
I think it's fascinating, not only because you can start, if you had one of those conspiracy theory minds, you could put Otto Binder in the middle and start drawing these strings out to all of these people in the pulp novels and comic books, and he would be like at the center of it all. It just seems kind of crazy from that point.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was an incredibly central figure, very influential, knew everybody, and his influences went far beyond his actual writing because of all the people he knew, the people he helped, and the influence his writing itself had on others. So, yes, he was definitely a central character. I don't know about conspiracy theories, but if you wanted to go there, you could do it.
I'm thinking if you're someone like The Question, you'd have this big wall all marked up with lines and note cards and everything. It'd be pretty crazy.
Well, he certainly knew them all. He went to a party at an apartment in New York where Lovecraft held court for a couple of hours and said he was one of the most fascinating speakers he ever heard.
Wow. It just boggles my mind when I think about that, because I have, this affection for the Cthulhu mythos and the Legion of Superheroes and Superman and everything that Binder touched, including what we'll get to in a moment, Captain Marvel. So it just is like, wow, this is stuff that maybe people have never heard of before. Why do you think that when it comes to talking about comic book greats, for a lot of people would recognize Julius Schwartz and Mort Weisinger, but the name Otto Binder may not be as well known?
I don't think Otto's name is as well known as Julius Schwartz or Mort Weisinger because he worked in anonymity, first of all, in the 40s. All of his work for Fawcett on the Captain Marvel and the Marvel family was done without any credit at all. And his work for DC in the 50s was done the same way. So he got out of comics in 1960 to start Space World magazine, and when comic fandom came along, Otto really wasn't around in terms of writing in comics. So fans weren't really reading stories by him from 1960 to 64. I think that had an effect.
Mm-hmm. But I find
he was out of the business.
Yeah, but I also find it interesting, though, that he kept a very detailed log of everything that he worked on. So when you ask how many comics did Otto Binder write, he could say, hey, I wrote 3,000 comics, and here they all are, and here's when they were published, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, Otto's records is quite a remarkable document, and I have the original.
Wow. Do you have those that you could put online, or have you ever thought about doing that, or are they just too precious for your research?
Well, no, they're going to appear in Alter Ego magazine. We're doing a special. I think it'll probably be over multiple issues, but we want to publish every page of those records in Alter Ego, where I'm associate editor. Roy Thomas is editor. Mm-hmm. So those will actually be published eventually in Alter Ego. It's set for print, so it's going to happen.
Wow, and that's a lot. I mean, that's like 75 pages or more in the original typed up or handwritten notes?
70.
Wow, that's so many. What is the final tally of comics that he has remembered that he wrote?
I couldn't tell you, but it's in the kind of a range, like 2,000 to 3,000.
Wow.
The one thing I can tell you is that Otto Binder was almost certainly the most prolific comic book writer of the 1940s, because he wrote not just for Fawcett and for Timely. He wrote a lot. He wrote a lot of Captain America for Timely, which is now Marvel, of course. Mm-hmm. But he also wrote tons of scripts for a company called Anglo-American, a Canadian company, and created a whole line of heroes for them, and did all this work that nobody has really gotten into much because they were Canadian comics. They're so hard to find, and many of them are very poor in terms of the artwork. But anyway, he was the most prolific writer, I'm quite sure, of the 40s. And, it's pretty amazing that he kept those records. However, he did not continue his records when he got back into comics in 1964 and worked in comics one way or another till about 1970. Those they're more documented because, at that time, credits were being published more in comics. Mm-hmm. But he didn't put those on his list.
Wow. Interesting. Let's talk about Otto Binder as a person who's very open-minded. That's the thing that I find very fascinating, because if you think about the time period, the 20s through, the 60s, very troubling times in the United States and around the world. But somehow Binder has this way of working characters and creations that seem to be exploring topics that other creators weren't. And I'm thinking specifically about Adam Link.
Well, absolutely. Adam Link, it was superficially a robot that had the mind of a human being and the feelings of a human being, and really he was pleading for understanding for this robot. But if you think about it, it's really an analogy or an allegory for race relations in America. That's one example. He did other stories that were had subtexts about how we should respect people who are different, which was a subliminal thing about perhaps gay people. Mm-hmm. Of course, when it comes to the Legion of Superheroes, then it becomes into a full-blown message of equality and egalitarianism.
Which is really interesting, because when you and I were first exchanging emails, it's like, well, Otto Binder only wrote one issue of the Legion of Superheroes, or at least initially before Jerry Siegel took over and started writing. But still, in that first issue, you can see that there is representation, inclusion, acceptance for different aliens, different abilities, different traits. And I find something really inspiring about that.
Well, I think that goes to the reason why the Legion of Superheroes is such an enduring, beloved series, because of that message of equality and inclusion. If you think about it, The Justice League had a Wonder Woman, and it sometimes it has had other women in it in the fairly early days, but it was mostly just Wonder Woman. And in the original stories in the Justice Society, she was also the secretary.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the Legion of Superheroes, you don't have one big dominant hero. Everybody's more or less equal. You might have a chairman, but you have Saturn Girl, who is every bit an equal with Lightning Lad and Cosmic Boy in that first story.
Mm-hmm.
He did name the team. That's pretty important.
Mm-hmm.
And that name includes a hyphen, and that hyphen is still part of the title. No one's ever fiddled with that. It's superheroes with a hyphen. And he named the Legion of Superheroes, and he established that message of inclusion with women and equality with women and men, or boys and girls together, working together, and not teasing each other or flirting with each other, but being very businesslike together, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, they had fun, but it was not about boys and girls like Archie or something. It was about serious people working together.
Mm-hmm.
And that is nowadays, teamwork and inclusion is one of the major themes of our society.
Yeah, totally. And that's why I think the Legion of Superheroes, as you said, is able to endure for so long. But before he got to DC, he was working over at Fawcett and probably wrote the most comics ever feature Captain Marvel, and probably is the force behind. I mean, he didn't create Captain Marvel, obviously, but he wrote most of the stories, introduced Captain Marvel Jr., introduced Mary Marvel, introduced, what's his name? Tiger, Taki Tani. Yeah. So he really had a lot of influence in, at the time, the most popular superhero in America, or maybe even the world.
Well, Otto Binder's role on Captain Marvel is just astonishing, because if you think about all the people who tried to imitate Superman, all the companies that tried to do a Superman imitator, Captain Marvel was the only one that started as a Superman imitator, but ended up becoming unique unto himself and outsold Superman. And that those sales had to do with Otto Binder's talent, because he is documented as writing over half of all the Marvel family stories, not just Captain Marvel, but as you said, Captain Marvel Jr., Mary Marvel, and everything else. So when someone writes half of one of the best-selling, most beloved series in the history of comics, that's a pretty big achievement.
Right. And so, unfortunately, there was a lawsuit between DC and Fawcett, or National Comics at the time, and Fawcett over likeness rights and whether Captain Marvel was lifted from that. And I think we can all agree that the lawsuit was mainly because Captain Marvel was outselling Superman. When this all fell out, what was Binder's reaction to this? Was this a big blow to him to be writing, at the top of the mountain, writing Captain Marvel, and then suddenly it's all yanked out from underneath him?
Well, when Otto Binder could no longer write Captain Marvel because it had been sued out of existence, he said later it just took the sunshine out of his life, because there was so much light in Captain Marvel and so much joy. And even though the comics in the early 50s weren't selling as well, the superhero comics weren't selling as well as they had, they were still the same spirit, and the quality was very good. Clarence Beck was still drawing them and so on. So it was a major blow for Otto. But I feel, as his biographer and having written a book about him, that it actually was a blessing, because he went to DC and began writing Superman. It kind of recharged his batteries. It gave him something different to write about, and suddenly he could pull from other areas of his imagination that weren't appropriate for Captain Marvel. Mm-hmm. So it kept him fresh, it kept him sharp. Whereas I think he would have creatively had a hard time staying with the Marvel family all through the 50s, coming up with new ideas.
Was he the highest paid writer in comics?
I think so, but it would have to do with his volume.
Mm-hmm.
He was certainly got the top rate. What he said was he was a prisoner of the golden rut, that he was stuck in a rut of making tons of money. And he said it's a good rut. It's a good rut to be in. You don't get a lot of recognition. You don't get a lot of respect, but you make a lot of trips to the bank.
Yeah. But he did have people who knew who he was, even though he may not be credited in some Captain Marvel stuff, or he may not only been known as Otto Binder. But people did track him down. Am I not mistaken? Did people not track him down to his house and say, hey, you're Otto Binder, you're the guy writing Captain Marvel, you're the guy writing Superman?
Well, Otto Binder was rediscovered in 1960 by Richard Lupoff, who wrote an article called The Big Red Cheese about his memories of buying Captain Marvel comics in the 40s as a boy. And he published it in a series called All in Color for a Dime in his fanzine Zero. And Zero #1, where it appeared, came out in 1960. And he took a copy of it up to Space World, where Otto was the editor and owner, and left it with the receptionist for Otto to see. And he received a long letter from Otto, and they got together, and as it turned out, Otto Binder did get involved in the early days of comic fandom, helping Richard Lupoff on Zero, helping Jerry Bales on Alter Ego, and helping Roy Thomas on Alter Ego when Roy took it over from Jerry. So Otto went to the earliest conventions. So he was a big supporter of it, but he said at the time, I never dreamed that there would be comic book fans. Science fiction fans, yes, but comic book fans? It took him totally by surprise.
It's interesting that you said science fiction fans, because that's the other thing that I find really fascinating about Binder, and maybe one of the things that helped push him more towards this idea of the Legion of Superheroes is that he put science into his fiction. He was more interested in trying to put in scientific fact to help people learn than maybe just making it up and fooling the reader.
Well, Otto Binder as a writer was not only in science fiction, but he was a science fact writer. He made, in the late 50s and early 60s, he made a lot of his money writing science fact, golden books that children read. There was millions and millions of copies were printed of these things, like Our Neighbor the Moon. And Our Neighbor the Moon must have sold 3 or 4 million copies to baby boomers.
I probably read an old copy of that.
Yeah, I bet you did, because it's just, you couldn't escape it.
Yeah.
And, this is during the era of the space race. But his most salient characteristics as a writer, you would find, would be, in addition to these themes of inclusion and the importance of female characters like Supergirl and Mary Marvel, of course, he co-created Supergirl, was that he would include science gimmicks in his stories and science fiction in his stories. And that's you see that in everything he wrote. He had a lot of stories of time travel, which is a science fiction idea, of future worlds, of what the future will be like, and brought in other science fiction elements into his plots and stories.
It's neat because when you think about comic books, you don't think about those kinds of things. I mean, certainly you see some other writers trying to do that when we're talking about how does the Flash use his powers, those kinds of things. Where does it come from? With Captain Marvel, it's all about magic, but being able to insert science into that, I think is a big plus. And as you said, once he left comics, he went to go start space magazines.
Oh, that's right. And then he took it a step further. He would go on radio shows to try to publicize Space World, and people would call in and ask him about UFOs and what he thought about those. And then at first he said, well, I until I see one, until I say hello to an alien, I'm going to be skeptical. I'm not going to believe it. But he gradually was worn down by the mountains of evidence in the 60s and ended up becoming kind of a granddaddy of the UFO movement.
Because his belief system was, if I'm not mistaken, he was more into the planet had been seeded by alien life. Is that the direction that he was going on?
Well, later he wrote one of the first books about what you'd call ancient astronauts, aliens that came to Earth and seeded the human race, yes. And because their really evolution doesn't explain some things a lot of people feel. And but initially it was he was just interested in UFOs. He got the idea of the ancient astronauts from a science writer and scientist named Max Flint, who sent it into him in an essay called "Tiptoeing Past Darwin" when he was at Space World, and that's where he started thinking about the ancient astronauts. But the UFO interest came up sort of independently of that, and he ended up writing several books about UFOs.
I find it interesting that initially he would be hesitant about it, since a lot of his stuff is about robots and outer space and, teenagers from the future.
Right. Well, there were science fiction writers in the 20s and 30s that never believed there would never be space travel. Mm-hmm. So, you could still have fiction even if you didn't believe it was happening. I think with Otto, he wanted to believe that there were UFOs. It made sense, that there had to be some other life out there in the universe, but he was just not going to put himself into the same group with a lot of people that, that on the fringes might seem a little out there. Mm-hmm. He was selling himself as a serious science writer, so he had to be careful of his reputation. But behind the scenes, he was getting more and more intrigued as the 60s went on.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned that people kept calling him because he would be invited on these radio circuits or television circuits to talk about science. Was he the Neil deGrasse Tyson of his day?
Well, not as much as Arthur C. Clarke became later when 2001 came out, and then we had the moonwalk. Then you had Arthur C. Clarke and Robert E. Heinlein. Binder was more in the early 60s during the initial space race, and he was more often on local television programs in the New York area.
Okay. All right. Let's go back to his transition from Fawcett to DC. Was that a difficult time for him? Because he's moving to somebody that basically sued him out of a job.
Well, moving from Fawcett to DC had its awkward moments for Binder. There's no question about it. He said he felt quite bitter about what National had done to getting rid of Captain Marvel as their competitor. But at the same time, one of his closest friends, two of his closest friends were editors there and offering him work. And, he was a businessman. He was able to, put it aside. And, but later when fandom came around in the 60s and he talked about his bitter feelings, his editors at DC said, don't talk about that stuff anymore. You're working with us now. You shouldn't be talking about those things.
But initially there was no problems from the higher ups when they found out that that the Captain Marvel writer was now writing for them. Nobody was like, hey, how dare we do this?
No, not at all. In fact, they were thrilled to have him because he had been so successful. Now, he had actually, Otto Binder wrote many stories for DC in the late 40s, but only for backup strips, like Robot Man and things like that. And he was perfectly happy to do that. But of course, he didn't work on Superman. And so the editors more or less kept it kind of under wraps. I don't think the management really realized. But when he came to DC in 1953 and began writing, for the science fiction comics and then later for Superman, I think the management was just happy to have someone who was as skilled as he was.
Mm-hmm. He didn't have a perfect life. I mean, we've been talking about all these accomplishments and all these accolades that people have thrown at him over the years, but he didn't have a super happy life, especially in the latter half.
Well, Otto Binder was many years of great success as a writer, but in the latter part of his life, tragedy kind of overcame his life. For one thing, and even before that, I should add that he became a heavy drinker, and in the late 50s and early 60s, with the pressure of Space World and getting along with Mort Weisinger, who ended up becoming quite difficult to get along with, he developed a drinking problem, and that, of course, didn't didn't help anything. But then, later in the 60s, he had one daughter, Mary, named after Mary Marvel. And she was a beautiful girl. And she was killed by a driver, a car. She was hit by a car and instantly killed when she was 15. Mm-hmm. In 1967. And this, when your only child is killed, this would shatter anybody, and it shattered him. Mm-hmm. And he never could recover from that because, you look forward in life to be optimistic. One of the things that helps people maintain their optimism as they get older is they look at their children and they have great hopes for their children. Well, that dream was over for him, and of course his drinking increased. So from 1967 until his passing in 1974, he was just struggling to make a living, and the joy of writing kind of went away. He lost his zest for writing at that point.
Do you think if the alcoholism and depression had not taken him, do you think he would look back and say, especially at fandom today, because as you said, fandom was just getting started. Do you think he'd look back at the legacy of characters that he wrote and created and see kind of the happiness and joy that it's brought to people?
Oh, I think he did. Even in his darkest hour, he knew that, because he could make a figurative quilt out of all the fan letters he got and wrap himself in it. People loved him, and they expressed their love to him in a lot of letters, visits, interviews. So he knew how beloved his characters were. He was very proud of what he had done, and people let him know that. So I think that is something to keep in mind, is that he did not feel forgotten or neglected at all. If he removed himself from the scene, it was because he just couldn't handle working and living close to New York City, so he moved into upstate New York with his wife to a little house out in the middle of nowhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you think is his greatest legacy? Is it pulp? Is it comic books? Is it Captain Marvel? Is it his space magazine? Is it his book writing? What is his biggest legacy, do you think?
Well, I think that his work and the Superman mythos would have to be considered Otto Binder's greatest legacy. Establishing so many things in the late 50s that we still have today, such as co-creating Supergirl, Superboy's dog Crypto, inventing Lana Lang, Lois Lane's sister, the bottle city of Kandor, the little Kryptonian city that Superman had in a bottle and could never enlarge. He probably did in some universe somewhere now, but back then he couldn't. And in general, bringing humanity to the Superman family of comic books that they had never had before, I think is his most enduring legacy, because of the continued popularity of these characters. And also, obviously, Captain Marvel would never be around today. He would have been a forgotten hero. If Otto Binder had not been working on him, the magic would not have been as strong, and the character wouldn't have sustained as long as it did. And I don't think the interest would be sufficient to have him be he's a pretty strong character at DC these days. There's supposed to be a Captain Marvel movie coming along eventually here. So he's not a top character, but I think that legacy is also very important.
Your book, Otto Binder, The Life and Work of a Comic Book and Science Fiction Visionary, is available now in a new edition that people can buy. Bill, what else are you working on?
Well, I finished a biography of Harvey Kurtzman, which won the Eisner Award for the best comics-related book of 2015. And I'm very proud of it. It's called Harvey Kurtzman, the Man Who Created Mad. And right now I'm working on an extended version of my memoir called Sense of Wonder, A Life in Comic Fandom, where I wrote about how comics saved my life as a kid and gave me all kinds of opportunity to become a writer and to learn to draw and all kinds of things. And now, late in life, writing about comics has given me a writing career. And so really fandom is the bookend of the beginning of my life and the latter part of my life now, and I hope it goes on for quite a while still. But it's the rest of the story that my original book, which came out in 1998, didn't have. That's what I'm working on: Sense of Wonder, A Life in Comic Fandom.
The Legion Clubhouse is a production of Major Spoilers Entertainment, LLC, and is produced by Steven Schleicher. Your hosts were Matthew Peterson and Steven Schleicher. You can follow Matthew at Mighty King Cobra and Steven at Major Spoilers. You can follow this podcast on Twitter at Legion Clubhouse. If you have questions or comments, send them to podcast@majorspoilers.com. I'm Jason Inman. Until next time, eat it, Grandpa.
This podcast is copyright 2024 by Major Spoilers Entertainment, LLC.